thank you all actually so much for giving me this space and opportunity to talk with you all tonight. I am Monica, and I've lived here in Charlotte for about 5 years, and I want to tell you a little bit of story about who I am before I actually jump into my presentation. So my grandmother, when she was about 18 years old, was told to pack everything she owned into 2 suitcases, and she was going to go to an unknown place for an unknown amount of time. The year was 1942, and FDR had just signed Executive Order 9066, which called for the unconstitutional incarceration of all persons of Japanese ancestry. So 120,000 people gathered up their belongings, many of them headed into the desert. And my grandmother and family went to a place called Manzanar. They spent a year of their life behind barbed wire with armed guard towers and machine guns facing in. My grandmother then spent about 4 decades of her life fighting for justice. She demanded an apology from the US government and wanted to make Manzanar a national park and a national historic site. And it was actually my first years of life when she was successful to be able to do that. And so now there is Manzanar as a national historic site as part of our national park system. So when I was 18 years old, my grandmother was clearly my hero, and I decided to apply and go to college in California so that I could actually be close to her. So I went to Pomona College, and she lived in Los Angeles, and so I went in part to be able to be really near her and be able to learn from her there. But within a year of me enrolling and attending Pomona, my grandmother passed away. Years of exposure to toxic air in Los Angeles had taken its toll on her lungs, and she was no longer able to keep fighting. So she had a cough for as long as I could remember. So then I decided to get a degree, as Sally mentioned, in environmental justice studies. That's good, you can go. Thanks, Ken's my pointer, so thank you, Ken. I got my degree in environmental justice studies because I took a class in environmental health, and I wanted to understand better what exactly had killed my grandmother, what was responsible, and in part it was particulate matter and air pollution, and the way that our industry, our fossil fuel industry, is taking the lives of too many people to make record profits. And so after I graduated, I actually got my first job was with the Sierra Club. And you can see me there at my first ever press conference wearing a Beyond Coal t-shirt at Indiana University, calling on the university president to retire that coal-fired power plant. I moved to Charlotte 5 years ago, and since graduating, I've helped work on 14 coal plant retirements, which has been pretty exciting, including 8 right here in North Carolina, which is exciting. Yay! We can clap for that. So I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. This topic is complicated. It often brings up pretty not great emotions. When we talk about issues of racism and gender discrimination and issues like that, feelings like shame and guilt and sometimes even despair are how we respond. And only if I think we're given real tools to think about how do we deal with these issues on a personal level, on a societal level, and at a systemic institutional level can we actually move from despair towards hope. So I'm going to start off today with some not great memories in history. And I think it's really important to ground what we're talking about in historical context. So I'm going to go over the history, very brief history of the conservation movement. And then I'm going to talk about the scope of the crisis we're currently facing, which I'm sure many of you know better than most folks do, honestly, in this country. And then I'm going to answer the question, why should environmentalists embrace social justice? And end with how we actually can start doing this work. So some of you may be wondering why we're having this conversation. To some, it may be obvious that issues of race and gender and environment are all valuable but distinct social movements. Others of us see these as interlocking crises and problems that cannot actually be separated. We hear activists today chanting things like Black Lives Matter, reproductive justice now, stop climate change. And we don't necessarily think of those people as being the same people holding those same signs at one protest, or that they're necessarily fighting in the same issues in the same movement. And I'm going to present tonight why I actually think we're more aligned than we are different. But to understand where we are today, we actually do have to look back to where we came from. So by a show of hands, once more, who recognizes who that is? Anyone? All right. No surprise. Shout out. Who is it? Teddy Roosevelt. Yep. And does anyone recognize this person? Nope, that's okay. It's, oh, some folks got it. Yeah, yes, John Muir. Great. So, some of the folks we consider the founders of the conservation movement, right?
Who was that?
John Muir. John Muir. And so for, let me see right here. Great. So for Grant and Roosevelt and other architects of our country's parks and games, wild nature was worth saving for its aristocratic qualities. And where these were lacking, they were indifferent. Said another way by Matthew Klinger, who is an environmental historian at Bowdoin College, they were setting aside wildlife for the worthy. So often, the modern, actually, people we consider the founders of the conservation movement were passing regulations that were more in favor of sportsmen over sustenance fishers, people, and hunters. The conservation movement started with the national parks, beautiful, historic things we are incredibly proud of. Many folks know that the Sierra Club was founded on May 28, 1892 by John Muir, who was elected its first president. And its first conservation campaign, the Sierra Club led efforts to defeat a proposed reduction in the boundaries of Yosemite National Park. But to define what we were talking about as national parks, in the definition, the original definitions that some of these folks used to define wilderness and define nature, it was devoid of people. And so to create national parks, to create these beautiful places we all enjoy and should, what actually happened though is they needed to forcibly remove the people that were there, who were Native Americans living on that land sustainably. So the creation of the national parks was with forced removal of Native peoples, and that was often accompanied by incredibly racist rhetoric. John Muir described the Yosemite Valley Mono Indians as mostly ugly, some of them altogether hideous. He said they lacked any right place in the landscape. He talked about the Merced River Indians as a strangely dirty and irregular life. These dark-eyed, dark-haired, half-happy savages led in this clean wilderness. So often in these quotes ascribed dirty and worthless with the indigenous peoples living there compared to the beautiful, pristine, clean, natural landscape and animals. Purdy is a Duke University School of Law professor, explains that in our national parks, a 1901 essay collection written to promote park tourism, Muir assured readers that, as to Indian, most of them are dead or civilized into innocence. In the same paragraph, Muir was more concerned with how human parody towards bears. Poor fellows, they have been poisoned, trapped, shot at, until they have lost confidence in brother man, than how with Native Americans had been killed and driven from their homes. So it's the comparison that, not that nature is equal to us, but that actually there's a parity difference of values on whose lives mattered. So Muir was not alone in this. And in fact, has anyone heard of this person? Probably not. His name is Madison Grant. He happened to be a very close friend of President Roosevelt's. And in 1916, he published a book called The Passing of Great Race, or The Racial Bias of European History. And it is a white supremacist text that warned of the decline of the Nordic peoples. He was concerned that the, quote, Alpine and Mediterranean populations were going to wash out the Nordics, who were a natural aristocracy marked by nobility. Adolf Hitler wrote Grant an admiring letter of this text, calling it his Bible. So for these conservationists, of which Madison Grant is also a founding father of the conservation movement, they prized expert governance of resources. It was not a far stretch to look then from managing forests to managing the human gene pool. It's not enough to simply think about this as the racism of the time. A Purdy University professor of law, again from Duke, explains that these wasn't just ordinary or casual racism. We have to remember that this was happening in a time just after and during and after the Civil War, when fusion politics of the 1880s and 1890s was actually helping getting more African Americans represented in elected positions from partnerships of different populations, this was a time that race issues were very much being discussed and trying to get remediated, that these types of conversations, which were calling for white supremacy, were happening. But that's just old theory, right? That's not relevant today, not with our modern conservation movement. Yeah, those folks might have been the founding fathers of some of our groups, but that can't still somehow be impacting what we're doing, right? Unfortunately, no. So there are many different ways this has continued to perpetuate into our modern conservation movement. In 1948, there were two major ecological texts that were published. William Vangott's Road to Survival embraced eugenics as a response to overpopulation. He was urging government officials to offer cash to the poor for sterilizations, which would have a, quote, favorable selective influence on the species. A second text, Our Plundered Planet, by Fairfield Osborne, forecasted that post-war humanitarianism would provide incompatible with our natural limits, and so therefore we needed to limit this species. 20 years later, in 1968, perhaps a more well-known text, Population Bomb, by Stanford University professor and his wife, warned of mass starvation of humans by the 1970s and 1980s due to overpopulation. This text, highlighting the problem of overpopulation, instead of looking at resource distribution, was used to justify genocide and imperial controls and policies. It was specifically targeted at racial minorities and other disadvantaged groups and called for a return to eugenics by many. It led to conversations about how we had to limit the population growth in continents like South America and Africa, instead of looking at the food crisis in relation to how we in the United States and Europe were looking for coffee and cattle replacing their farmland. In 1970, we have the kickoff of Earth Day and a massive resurgence of the environmental movement. This is happening, of course, during a massive surge of civil rights and racial justice, women's equality, LGBTQ rights. Lots of movements are happening in our day. Before my time, but many of you probably were there. This theory of putting people and nature against each other and of which people were deserving of environmental protection continued to impact many organizations, and especially actually the Sierra Club well into the 1970s. So the Sierra Club did a poll of its members in 1972, asking whether or not they should be concerned itself with the conservation problems for special groups as the urban poor and ethnic minorities. Even the framing of this is pretty problematic, right? Where we're saying that the environmental issues are somehow different for whites than for blacks, and this is a pretty interesting thing. And the results were pretty disparaging. 40% were strongly opposed to working on issues that impacted people of color, where only 15% were supportive. So, in response to an environmental movement that was largely, even up in the 1970s, ignoring the needs of people of color and low-income communities, there was a resurgence of environmental protection by those communities for their own rights. So this has largely been dubbed as the environmental justice movement, and kind of took its modern-day roots in the 1980s. It happened in part because of disasters at places like Love Canal, where a school was being built on a decades-long toxic dump, and a mother, Lois Gibbs, organized her neighbors door to door, knocking on them, since there were so many different kids who were having learning disabilities and birth defects and health issues, including her own child. That was only finally addressed in 1978. And Cancer Alley in Louisiana, where some folks noted there were 15 different types of cancer on one block, and that was in the corridor of the petrochemical industry. Even here in North Carolina, folks might be familiar with the case where Warren County, which is up there in the northern border with Virginia, had a landfill that was created to collect all of the PCB dumps from neighboring states. This county is predominantly African American, and was going to be exposed to all of the toxins from all of the neighboring counties and states. And so what happened, as you can see here, was actually people protested and said, do not bring these trucks full of poisons that they knew were going to have negative health impacts on them, their community, on their children, into it. Unfortunately, this case actually wasn't successful until about a decade ago. And in Warren County, that dump did get filled full of tons and tons of PCBs. But it did spark something else. So in 1987, the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice published an incredibly influential report, one of the first of its kind, that documented the relationship between race and environmental pollution. And they looked at the unequitable distribution of environmental pollution to specifically African Americans and other ethnic minorities as a form of more racism, of modern day racism, and helped spark a movement of people then protesting across the country against toxins that were previously able to not get dumped in richer, whiter neighborhoods, in part because of the political power that whiter and richer neighborhoods were able to have to prevent that from actually happening. So that's my very brief history of our movement. And now I want to talk a little bit about where we are today. So I don't have to tell you all the scale of the crisis that we're currently facing. This is perhaps the greatest ecological crisis we have ever seen. Climate change is causing massive habitat destruction, leading to species extinction at a faster rate than we've seen before. Islands, especially those in the South Pacific, are going underwater, unable to maintain their communities and their land. Desertification is drying up and causing massive droughts, which are leading to more famine and then more global political unrestness and war. Fires are devastating our forests. Floods are devastating our coasts. Extreme weather is now an understatement for the most normalized, crazy patterns we are seeing. We're also in a great social crisis, where the murder of African Americans in this country by law enforcement is greater than what was lynched. Deportations of immigrants in this country in the last 8 years, specifically Latinos and Asians, have been at record numbers, destroying families. And the affordable housing crisis, as so many people have been unable to pay for their mortgages, are pushing neighborhoods and people into crisis of homelessness. So these impacts are happening, and they are hitting everyone, but they aren't hitting all of us the same way. So there are disproportionate impacts even for the pollution that we're seeing. 68% of African Americans and 40% of Latinos live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. The 30-mile radius is the amount that air pollution is causing health damage. African American children are 3 times as likely to suffer from asthma attacks than white children. Latino children are 40% more likely to die from an asthma attack than a white child. Overall, communities of color breathe dirtier air, 40% more dirty air. So we are all breathing dirty air, but some of us are breathing air that is actually different and worse. And then we look at some of the social crises of our time. People living in poverty. Overall population in the United States is 1 in 6. That disproportionate impact is on African Americans and Latinos. And while overall Asian Americans have less poverty, when we look at specific communities, Hmong and Cambodian, those numbers are incredibly high, higher than are hitting African Americans and Latinos here. And with greater poverty and lower disposable income, it leads to other compounding challenges, especially health issues. When you have these upper respiratory health issues, heart attacks, heart disease, especially concerning for children and seniors and expecting mothers, and you have less access to health care, in part because you have less disposable income, or perhaps there aren't hospitals in your neighborhoods, with nearly 1 in 3 Latinos and 1 in 5 African Americans still lacking health insurance. Compounded again by workplace hazards, because where you work can have a different impact on the environment that you have. Many different Latinos who happen in migrant labor, who work in agriculture and landscaping and construction, are often exposed to more harms in their workplace, leading to greater risk. The toxic chemical formaldehyde is linked to asthma, is found in glues, and insulation and wood products that construction workers are disproportionately exposed to. Asthma-related toxins are found in paints and cleaning products and carpet and foam cushions that many women who work in hotels cleaning up are exposed to on a daily basis. And that's even then worse compounded when you have language and cultural and education barriers that can lead to not having access to resources that are needed to help deal with these issues. If you're worried about being unable to actually communicate with your doctor in your native language, it makes it a lot harder to go to the doctor's office when you have a problem. Or even if you can communicate, if you're not sure they're going to respect your religious or cultural perspectives. That's especially true for the LGBTQ community, who often avoid medical if they don't think their doctor is going to be open to who they are as a person. So all of this compounds and makes people less resilient and less able to see how we actually deal with the massive environmental crisis of climate change. And we've seen that. We've seen that when Hurricane Katrina hit, of how African Americans and the Vietnamese population there were disproportionately impacted. We saw it with Hurricane Sandy and how low-income communities struggle to find housing and still do. And we're seeing it today in Flint, Michigan, where kids are being poisoned knowingly by the state government. So I was asked to lead a presentation on why should environmentalists care about social justice? My answer is really simple. It's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do to repair historical wrongs. None of us were around in the 1890s. But that doesn't take away the fact that some of the people who founded the movement we're currently involved in did it with some pretty wrong ideologies that caused and continue to cause disproportionate impacts. And it's the right thing to do to address how those impacts are currently happening today. That's not enough. We've actually been asked to do it. So in 1990, a group of environmental justice activists wrote a letter to 10 leaders of environmental groups. And they wrote a letter, and it's called the Letter to the Group of 10, and they specifically asked for our groups, including the Sierra Club, to address racial and gender and socioeconomic class issues. They asked us to. In 2014, a report was published called Green 2.0 by Dr. Drusita Taylor for the University of Michigan. She studied the hiring practices of today's environmental organizations, including the Sierra Club. And as someone who works for one of the largest environmental organizations in the country, this is what it looks like. It looks like most of our staff aren't actually representing the people who are most impacted by the environmental pollution that's happening today. So why should environmentalists do this work? Why should we think about race issues? Why should we think about class? Why should we think about gender? It's the right thing to do, and as Martin Luther King reminds us, to never ever be afraid to do what's right, especially if the well-being of a person or an animal is at stake. Because society's punishments are small compared to the wounds we inflict on our souls when we look the other way. So if all of this isn't enough to convince you, let me put it a different way. To change everything, we need everyone. Woo. And the truth is, we are trying to change really major systems here. Our energy and electricity systems, our transportation systems, our agriculture systems, our democracy. We're trying to take back our entire planet for all of us. That is not a little task. And we're going up against some of the most politically powerful corporations who are buying our government officials and representing profits over people. So if we're trying to change everything, we actually need everybody. And the truth is, the polling data shows, without people of color on our side, environmentalists, we lose. People of color are going to be the majority of this population. It's actually already true in kids in many school systems, including across California. Here in Charlotte, we're seeing increased numbers of youth of color in our society. This is the new face of this country. And poll after poll after poll shows people of color actually are more concerned about our environmental issues than white people are. So this is a racial gap on climate change, and it shows you over time. You see how that gap actually in 2014 is even increased. Again, poll after poll after poll. So here you can see 70% of African Americans in a 2012 poll consider themselves environmentalists. 60% prioritize environmental protection over economic growth. Oh, sorry, that was Asian Americans. For African Americans, 89% of black voters supported regulation of carbon dioxide. 2012 poll of Latinos said that 70% of Latinos believe climate change is already happening, compared to the overall total of 52. So why do people of color care more about environmental issues? Because they're living it every single day. These are things that are in people's lives. They're experiencing it. Why do so many people migrate to this country? In addition to laws like NAFTA and CAFTA, when the water on your farm dries up and you live in Durango, Mexico, you come to this country for work because you can no longer farm because climate change is devastating your farmland. That's part of what's driving our migration right now. So, hopefully now you're convinced. So how do we do this? How do we go from all of that doom and gloom? How do we go from the feelings of shame and guilt and confusion and despair into hope? We do it little by little, everywhere and all the time. So we have to think about this work on how we do it on a personal level, on ourselves. It takes some internal reflection, and that's going to be uncomfortable. It also is going to take us to figure out how to do it in community with each other. And how do we change our systemic institutions, our organizations, like the Sierra Club? How do we keep bringing this work to every single level of society? So the Sierra Club has endorsed and has a new policy, which is incredible, and I think a shining example to keep following. And it's called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, DEI. Just make the acronym there. And it addresses a bunch of different issues, right? So we're looking not just at race and ethnicity, but definitely race and ethnicity, but also socioeconomic class. We think about poor people in this country. By numbers, most poor people are white. We think about gender. We think about age, geographic region. The Southeast, we live in the dumping grounds for the country, right? We experience much more of the pollution here in the Southeast than is actually spread out across the Northeast or the Northwest or the West Coast. We think about religion, and thinking back in 1987, how the United Church of Christ actually helped lead the way to think about what these issues look like and how faith institutions can actually be a major role. We think about education and who's getting access to what type of information. And we think about nationality. Not everyone living in this country is a US citizen. And then we think about what is often called the triple bottom line. So we think about pushing that for companies. What does it mean for us to push that for ourselves? How do we think about integrating economic, social, and environmental solutions in everything that we're doing and advocating for? This is a pretty great quote by United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, right? He gets that sustainable development, which is what we're all eventually trying to work for, actually has to have and has this triple bottom line. So what I'm not talking about is the term I've called the issue Olympics. Some people might be familiar with the term oppression Olympics. What I'm not talking about is saying one person or one experience is more valuable than another. Because to the biologist that's saving that endangered species of salamander, that is the most critical work for that person to do. As it is for the child fighting for immigration reform to make sure that their mother or father doesn't get deported and destroy their families. As it is for the African American to fight to make sure the police aren't murdering their kids at the rate in which we are seeing the execution of black people today. None of these issues is more important or more inherently valuable than another. They're connected. So instead of comparing issues and saying what is more important and more valuable, what I'm calling us to think about doing is not comparing, but connecting. Where do these things overlap? Where do they intersect? What are the spaces when they're shared? And then if they're shared, how do we come together to actually collaborate and work together for a world that works for everyone, the salamanders to all of us? So that's an especially important question when thinking about who's in leadership. Because we go to things where we feel comfortable, and in our society today, people have to look like how we look to bring them to the table. So when I'm making decisions on things, I often ask myself the question, who's not sitting at this table? Whose voices am I not hearing? That's one of the steps I try to take as a staff person in leadership roles with the responsibility to make decisions. So 3 steps that we can take. We can listen and learn. We can go have coffee with an activist from a different movement. We can pick up a book. We can watch a documentary. We can show up at a different rally that we don't usually show up to. We got invited to an NAACP voter rights rally. That's an issue all of us can get behind, and maybe a group that we don't always attend. We can start learning and connecting. And there's a lot of different movements in our time, from the conservation movement to the environmental justice, women's rights, labor, anti-poverty, racial justice, indigenous, LGBTQ. There's a lot of different places these things overlap more often than we actually think about. Number 2, we can adopt the Jemez principles. So I actually brought a handout, and we'll hand it out. Thank you, Hannah. So the Jemez principles, these are the summary of them, was one of the requests by environmental justice groups to the big group of 10. And they asked for us to consider, what does it mean to build a movement that's inclusive, that is bottom up, which is, this is as bottom up as we get right here, grassroots activists sitting in a room talking about how to do this work. How do we let everyone speak for themselves, and then we don't actually speak for anyone else but our own lives and expectations? How do we work in solidarity and neutrality with other groups and other movements? How do we build these socially and economically and environmentally just relationships with each other? And what is our commitment to personal self-transformation? And besides the Jemez principles, we can actually work on and engage on collaborative campaigns. So what the heck does working in solidarity and neutrality look like, right? It's really great and really heady theory, but what does that actually look like on the ground? So I actually say this chapter of the Sierra Club has done some incredible work in the past 5 years that I've seen it, doing that work. And this is one of my favorite stories. So many of you knew Bill Gupton, and Bill and I and many of you in the room, raise your hand if you worked on the no rate hikes for dirty energy effort. All right, woohoo! So we came together, as some of you may recall, and for those of you who didn't, to request that a Duke Energy rate hike. They were trying to raise our electricity rates 20% to pay for upgrades to natural gas and coal-fired power plants. So that concerns us as environmentalists, because natural gas and coal are the leading causes of our global climate change, causing massive pollution from coal ash to fracked water, right? A major crisis. But 20% increase in electricity rates, that hits seniors on fixed incomes. That hit single mothers. That hit low-income communities. That disproportionately impacts African Americans, Latinos, and Southeast Asians in our city, in our state. So Bill and I sat down about 5 years ago and helped form a coalition. And the coalition included folks like Hector from Action NC. It included folks like the NAACP and the Center for Community Change and the AARP and Sierra Club and Greenpeace. And we brought together the strangest bedfellow coalition this city had seen. And we worked together on a shared effort. And it was a pretty incredible opportunity to think about how much more powerful we are when we come together. The Utilities Commission had never seen hearings like that one. They went to 1, 2 in the morning. Many of us stayed up all night to make sure we got our testimony in. And that rate hike was reduced from 20% down to 7%. Now, it wasn't the 0 we wanted, but 7%, it really is a difference for the mother whose child is having to pay for asthma medication caused by the coal plants that rate hike was paying for, and her Duke bill. It made a difference in people's lives. And it made the difference to help retire 8 of the coal-fired power plants across our state. That's how it works. So when we come together and bring us all in the same room at that decision-making table, when we bridge differences, we are much more powerful and able to win the victories that all of us want to win to have the better world for us all. I'm leaving you with my favorite quote. It's credited to Aboriginal activists in Australia. It says, if you have come here, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Thank you. Thank you.